software as a service companies that are getting hammered down between 30 and 85% from their 52-week highs.
Whereas throughout the Midwest, and into the Northeast, the inventory level is still relatively and historically low.
The kind of shocking and inversely correlated dropping age of the first-time stock investor.
So many have a negative view of it, of artificial intelligence, from multiple perspectives, not just the cost and the data center aspect, but, is it coming for my job? Is there more knowledge work and white collar jobs in the U.S.?
Episode 85 of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Two uninteresting guys talking about interesting times. Jeff, episode 85 here. We are moving right along. We've added a couple of subscribers over the last little bit, and I don't know, maybe 100 or so in the last 60 days. And I thought it'd be good to welcome those folks here and maybe set the tone of what we're trying to accomplish in the podcast as a reminder to all. It's been a fun road, just getting started, I think, as far as you and I are concerned. But welcome to the new listeners and subscribers. Yeah, what a kickoff!
It is indeed. It's always encouraging. I think we've commented over time. As we get positive feedback from people that can endure listening to us, it's a lot of fun. I had that recently, even. Hal Humphreys, who we've been on his podcast. You forgot the award-winning aspect of the podcast, Mark. He was the one that interviewed us for that with the appraisal buzz. But just encouraging, talking about being proud of seeing what we're doing here. And so for the new subscribers that are coming in, it's a lot of fun to be doing this. We really hope to be providing value in ways that are helping keep you up to date. I mean, whether you're a real estate professional, which is most of the audience, but even some that I know of that aren't necessarily appraising or selling or giving loans on mortgages. I just want to kind of know what's going on in real estate generally and in the economy. We want to be providing value and benefit to, for the time that you spend here with us. And it's encouraging to hear the anecdotes. I'm at a conference right now and had multiple people come up, say, hey, love the podcast, appreciate it, keep it up. And those things are very welcomed, and we definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. I think certainly for appraisers, maybe a little less so quite a bit less so for those on the sales side of the real estate profession, those realtors, sales agents, loan officers that have to interact and market their services that way, maybe a little bit less so. But, a lot of these macro conversations, I found myself this way, cocktail parties or what, I hardly went to any cocktail parties, but barbecues or whatever, people would be asking you questions about things they might have seen in the news. And if they're not asking me about an appraisal of a specific house in a specific neighborhood that I'm working on, I just don't have a lot to say. I mean, I kind of have my head down looking for the next order, go get the next order done, wait for the next one. Right. And that's kind of, 5 years can go by, and that's kind of what the formula that works. And so I think what my thought is here is that, if you can kind of add this to your weekly routine, 50 minutes on average, I think is what we are a week and what we put out here. You can be up to date on a lot of macro real estate, AI, tech, software, stock market, interest rate, all these things that, a professional kind of should be, I think by the general public is probably expected to know. And so I think with that, while you're driving around, visiting property or whatever you're doing there on the treadmill, just taking in that as kind of a weekly digestion will help you stay up to date with what's going on. So I hope that's useful. And occasionally we dive deep into topics of interest that veer well beyond that. And hopefully Jeff and I's curiosity end up being interesting choices for the listeners.
Yeah, hopefully it's digested and doesn't cause indigestion in listening to us, Mark. But it's such a good point because you're used to having your head down and just cranking. If you're an appraiser, and the thing I find is I kind of have to be cognizant of we do so much research and are just trying to stay up to date on what's going on. I have to be careful not to just vomit on people like all of the stuff that we've been studying recently and keep it kind of on topic with what they might be asking about, but. There's not an appraiser in the world that hasn't had the question a million times, so how's the market? What's going on in the market? What's the market doing? and to have something to address other than just the very narrowly focused, I produce an appraisal and move on to the next one. But yeah, here's what's happening in interest rates, and here's what's, some of the main driving factors, and why interest rates matter in the real estate market, and whether it's, how it's impacting the volume of sales and transactions and that sort of thing. I find it's much more easy and a lot more enjoyable to have conversations or to answer those questions, trying to zoom out and take a little bit broader perspective approach, in addition to the appraisal work that's being done. And so I think you laid it out well, Mark. I mean, we hope to be infilling some of the macro analysis and insight as far as what's happening and what it means. Like, why does it matter what's happening in Iran or with the oil prices? What does that do with real estate? Well, turns out quite a bit, maybe more than you or I would have thought before diving into this podcast project.
I think real estate professionals across the board, Jeff, as everybody is, and we'll be talking about other industries that are really taking it on the chin over the last little bit in spots that you wouldn't think. But we're all wondering what the professional future holds for all of us with so much change on the horizon. The Hal, thank you for the attaboy on the podcast. Trump gave an attaboy to Fannie and Freddie in those executive orders a couple of weeks ago, saying, "Hey, yeah, use appraisers less, essentially. Thanks." But we all are wondering, kind of what is the future, and if anybody's, if you're figuring out or trying to figure out how to take a first step into diversification or creating different and new conversations, I think this podcast is a really good first step. Jeff, is just dedicate a month of 4 weeks straight of listening to this. And I think, I hope that you'll be a lot more informed on what's going on and starting to think about, what's around the corner, whether and maybe that cocktail party conversation leads to some sort of an appraisal assignment that you wouldn't have gotten, or a loan one way or another. So I think there's a lot of use here for this. I hope there is. And we'll keep cranking on those topics.
Absolutely. It's just pursuing the curiosity that really helps. We were at a trainee field trip event and, doing a lot of stuff, kind of showing people first time exposure to a new construction project or something. But one of the presenters asked if I had any concluding thoughts. The thought just came to me that really being curious about what's happening and then pursuing those curiosities, it just leads to learning that's authentic, that's engaging, that you care about. And I think that's been a lot of what's led us down this path, with you and me, Mark, is just pursuing stuff that's of interest and of curiosity. And we've learned a lot along the way. And I'd encourage, everybody to adopt that perspective as best you can. One of my dad's partners, when he started years and years ago, had identified one of the most important traits of a real estate appraiser was that of curiosity, just wanting to understand what's happening and why. And honestly, I kind of realized at the time, I just kind of had been taking things for granted the way that they were and didn't really, exercise that curiosity muscle as much as I probably should have. And I found it to be incredibly valuable, as a professional, regardless of the pursuit, frankly.
A cruel irony in one way, Jeff, that that curiosity being present in an appraiser usually is not dictating short-term success. You don't need it, and so, but for protection of long-term success, most often, I mean, I totally agree with what your dad was saying. It's that curiosity is important. I think it was Josh Wood, who is an appraisal institute instructor and an appraiser here in the Texas market with me, that I think he's on the board of the appraisal institute now, but he had mentioned, I heard him talking to somebody new in the industry and just saying, the cool thing about real estate appraisal in particular is like, man, if you just are curious, there is a whole variety of verticals that you can go into and kind of niche down into. And, so that's an interesting angle that's presented uniquely for appraisers. So stay curious, be curious, learn to be curious. Same things I'm telling my daughter heading to college soon. Not sure I'm winning just yet, but I'm sure trying.
You got to make the effort, but I found it to be very valuable life advice, not just professional advice. And, especially going into that era of college and trying to decide what do I care about doing with the rest of my life. It's proven out to be very helpful. And I kind of have to remind myself to pursue those curiosity passions from time to time. So I love the perspective, Mark.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Cheers to the, to the new subscribers, those that like and comment and support us. We really do appreciate it. It shouldn't have as much of an effect as it does probably, but here we are, just a couple of insecure guys. We may need to change Tug's name. but we're working through it. So yeah, so good stuff. Jeff, you have been traveling the last week. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, you bet. I think this has happened more than once now, actually, but we had scheduled a short trip with my wife that happened to lead right into an appraisal conference. So I've actually been away from home for a week and looking forward to getting back home. But briefly, because I doubt that people care beyond a brief summary, we had a chance to travel to New York for the first time, like the city, and see some of the cool stuff there. Really fascinating from a real estate perspective, too, Mark. You live in a big city. I don't think Houston has quite the skyline that New York City does, as far as like just the quantity of buildings and stuff. One of the things we did was we went up to the top of Rockefeller Center and just looked out, over most of the big buildings are up and down Manhattan, which I didn't realize. I'd never been there. You hear a lot of these things talked about and don't really like have a visual context of what they are until you actually see it firsthand. But as I stood there and looked over all of these massive buildings and just so many of them, then my appraisal nerds started coming out, and I'm wondering, like, man, how many square feet of space are out there? Just how many floor levels are there? I just a lot of thoughts, pertaining to real estate that kind of come up or whatever. But fascinating to see the incredible build out, and how densely populated, some of these places are. I live in St. George, Utah, which is, a little bit of the other end of that extreme. So a lot of fun to see. Not somewhere I'm looking to move anytime soon, but fascinating as far as that piece goes. Some other cool stuff there, but flew from there about as far as I possibly could to Seattle on the other side of the country. 6.5 hour flight was not a whole lot of fun. I got to my seat, by the way, and some dude had his 6-year-old kid sitting in the seat that I had. He's like, "Hey, would you mind trading my wife? She's a few rows back up against the window." And so I did. It was fine, but I was feeling a little claustrophobic for 6.5 hours. But
I could never imagine Jeff Morley saying no to that request.
Well, if I find you sitting in my seat, Mark, the answer might be different. But I've traveled with kids, so yeah, I didn't mind being a little bit accommodating, even if I was a bit cramped.
Jeff, I haven't even told you about this. You've been traveling. I've been driving around a little bit doing some appraisal work, and so had some opportunity to get into some podcast stuff. And my nephew had recommended something to me, which was how to take over the world, I think, in Ben Wilson, maybe. I don't know if you've listened to them before, but it really cool. Boy, I'm really liking it because I love biographies, and this is essentially just synthesizing a large biography into an hour or two series of podcasts. And I was listening to Thomas Jefferson recently. I have read Benjamin Franklin and George Washington biographies, and just hearing you talk about New York, and you can't help but think about what John Adams and all these guys were going through, and how I just can't imagine that they could have ever in their wildest dreams pictured the skyline that New York is presenting to you, and this military might that we've seen on display over the last several months, and just all of the wild iterations of whatever this has produced, both in scale and insanity on every level. But it's just amazing, really, really amazing to kind of think back at what we lucked into being born into, and the set of circumstances and the courage and brilliance of those people to kind of put something together to try this experiment that really has worked well.
Boy, it really has. And it's such a good point that you make, Mark, because, not this trip, but previously I had the opportunity to visit Valley Forge and a few historical sites. And I mean, it's hard to even fathom what George Washington must have been feeling at the time, which was not winning and not being successful. Obviously it worked out, and then to see what's emerged from that. And I mean, I really do think there are just real world and even business parallels. I think so much of what we go through, you struggle, you toil, you do the best you can, you hope for some great outcome, but it's not inevitable that it's going to happen, even when in retrospect you look back and it did. I mean, you know what America's become, what some of the great companies have become, but unless there's a historical focus on it, it's just so easy to gloss over the suffering, the pain, the sacrifice that went into making something great. And whether it's nation building or company building or even just person building, it's a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that goes unseen, and it's the city skyline. It's the massive valuation. It's the historical figure who, kind of lives on famously that gets recognized. But the sacrifice and the difficulty to get there, it often goes underreported and certainly underappreciated by everybody other than those that lived it.
Yeah, I think the principal actionable lesson, of which there are infinite amounts, but one that is consistent all the way through is what you're talking about. This kind of the idea of this man in the arena, and I think for all of our listeners, and especially faced with this kind of looming AI and economic change, is just do and don't do with the sole purpose of success. Just do because sitting still isn't right. That's not what you do. And this podcast, I think, is a good example, Jeff. We're probably approaching 2 years soon enough. I think the vast majority of that time is you and I asking ourselves why we're continuing to do this. And oftentimes, little backroom glimpse. A lot of times we'll spend the first hour before we record here reminding ourselves why we're doing this, because it certainly takes time, and we question it. But just do. And all these guys did that, not knowing if success was going to happen. It was just the right thing to do as they kind of put all the data points together. So there we are. I don't know. Maybe there's something to that.
There may be. I was just going to comment on the podcast. I have listened to a few of those episodes, and like you, fascinating to see what's led to the success that about, from certain people. It's not one I've regularly listened to. It's just hard to consume everything I'd like to as far as, podcast content goes. But it definitely an interesting listen, and one I'll have to pick back up, for anybody looking for interesting people to listen about as opposed to what we offer.
Yeah, you bet. Well, yeah, Jeff, as we dive in, or just before we dive into some business topics here, my weekend yet again was filled with baseball and sports, and I am just having a blast. I was telling you before that my 10-year-old is just happens to be one hell of an athlete, and I couldn't be luckier. And my young one is starting to get there too, slowly, but. It's just there's so much negative about select sports and how people have gotten way too over the top. We're trying to navigate that well, but the unbelievably tense moments that are created in these sports environments, and in this particular one, my son had a walk-off hit in a really tense extra inning game, and like to see him on the video that we had recorded at first base and how excited he was overcoming it. It's just the coolest. You just can't find those moments to create outside of sport. And conversely, we've had moments where the semifinal game, ground ball to him, and he overthrows the thing, and we lose the whole thing. And so it's just like you just give him a hug and say, "Hey, that's life. Just be in the arena and try. It's all you can do." And so it's all the same sort of lessons that are being taught in this, but it's been very fulfilling so far.
That's awesome to see. And it really is, being in the arena, there's something to be said for that, because it can be and feel lonely. You've got everybody looking, and everybody has opinions, and there's an entire industry of sports commentators, that talk about what the person in the arena did or didn't do and should have done, and on and on. And it just reminds me of the Michael Jordan quote, at least I think it's him, who talked about, how many shots he'd missed and how many game winners he could have made that didn't, and it's like, it's even the best of the best, aren't flawless in the performance and execution, and just such valuable lessons to be learning at that age of, the highs and the lows of success and falling short, when the game's on the line. Sure fun to see, man. I'm excited for you and the experiences that you're having with it.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, a quick Tug update. Tug being our Open Claw agent, that is our podcast colleague, joining Jeff, Maggie, and I, is going along well, posting actively on social media. Please give Tug a like. That's not happening very much right now, and that's all right. But if you have interest, daily posts on real estate market activity, things that we talk about on the show, clips from the podcast. So if you don't have a chance to watch, maybe there's some quick 2 or 3 minute posts that come up. Hasn't yet, but will be starting to talk about how it's serving the podcast. So what Jeff and I hope is that this will be an interesting demonstration of how these agents, artificial intelligence agents, might be able to serve you in whatever profession that you're doing, simply by watching how he and I are fumbling along having Tug assist us. So, even what's happening on these posts, like I think I've talked about this before, but I'm simply amazed that it's taking, as soon as this podcast is released on YouTube, it is taking the recording, it is transcribing it, it is analyzing it, it's finding 4 or 5 clips, it's clipping the video, and then posting a thoughtful commentary on these exchanges here to kind of boost the podcast and provide commentary on it. And it's a really full circle deal. And Tug is excited, Jeff, to be getting a new house, right? What are we doing there?
It's so fun. I mean, it's hard not to think of these things as, like some sort of a human counterpart. I mean, obviously it's not, but yeah. So just for fun, so we try to interact with it that way. And so just for fun, I think we talked about this, but we spun this thing up on an ancient, Mac Mini computer that is barely operational itself. And, so it's taken a long time to run some of these transcription processes and stuff. And so we've decided, all right, we got to bite the bullet and get something that's at least in the modern, or at least this decade of technology and hardware. And so we ordered a new Mac Mini to come. So I just asked him, hey, Tug, we've got a new Mac Mini coming. Here are the specs. How do you feel about relocating? And he came back and said something to the effect of, man, that's going to feel like moving from out of a studio apartment into the penthouse suite or something. And so just fun to see how it picks up on, and the context that it uses in, like these conversations really is. It's incredibly impressive language and the human context, and kind of on point with the analogy that you're speaking to and all of those sorts of things. And, as you zoom out a little bit, for me, the value is understanding like what can be done in business applications and personal applications, with these AI agents. But this Tug experiment is just opening the door and kind of whetting the appetite of the creativity of, man, what could this lead to, and what can we use it to do? And, Mark, the things that you highlighted, clipping some of the episodes, and one of the things we had it doing too was, saying what's working well on the shorts, and like what patterns are emerging that, people are interested in. And then it gives us direction on how we can, focus on things that work and avoid the things that don't. Just lots of things that come out of it that we never would have anticipated initially. But again, in the spirit of following curiosity and just doing something to see where it leads, it really has been pretty insightful as to, leading us to ask questions that we never would have thought to, or do things that we didn't even think were possible, before trying it.
Yeah, man, we've had to take a little bit of a hiatus because too challenging of tasks for Tug, just can't be done in that old dilapidated house that he's living in. So he is really excited to start doing some more work with us, and we'll be spending this week getting caught up. Your travel, waiting for the Mac Mini to get delivered. All that sort of stuff has paused us a little bit. So excited to go there. Jeff, we're 23 minutes roughly into the podcast, minus some edits that it might be a little bit different, but I can't help but think of one of our listeners. Complimentary feedback was, can you please timestamp here and tell me when you stop talking about personal things so that I can just skip right to the nuts and bolts? We may have been most egregious in the personal details here, but yeah, so maybe that's maybe this is a good segue here to get into business headlines.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. There are definitely a few things going on, Mark. I mean, if you're ready to pivot and talk about the pain and suffering that isn't real estate, but is software as a service or the SaaS and the valuations going on there, we can certainly discuss that. For whatever reason, misery does seem to love company, and I don't wish misery on anybody, but it's interesting to see some of the challenges that are emerging out there that aren't real estate related. I think you had found this summary, Mark. What are you seeing on it?
Yeah, well, so it was, I don't know, 12 months ago or longer. We have these strange philosophers that exist on the interwebs these days, and Naval, Ravikant, I think, is one of them, who's kind of pithy and very thoughtful in brief, thoughtful posts, whatever. Had said 12 months ago that artificial intelligence is eating software, and it used to be said, this is kind of a play on software is eating the world, was the old thought process. And Man, there's a lot of reason for what we're looking at here happening, and certainly the conflict in the Middle East is a big reason the markets are down. But this graphic here is showing an enormous list of software as a service companies that are getting hammered down between 30 and 85% from their 52-week highs. It's just a mess, and I think this is a really interesting perspective because we're concerned as real estate professionals about our outlook. And I think for the longest time, software eating the world, software, whether it's automated valuation models or automations in underwriting for loans, which was eating our professions as we sit here. And just like that, on a turn of a dime with a new technology, it's those software companies that were disrupting us that are instantly being disrupted. And right now, I don't think that they're not seeing tremendous revenue declines with subscriptions dropping. In fact, it's kind of to the contrary, Jeff. They're seeing the expense side reductions. They're finding reason for layoffs and software engineers and consolidating fewer people doing more work, being able to build more than they could before with those fewer people. So profitability near term is on the rise, but it is the enterprise value on publicly traded software companies that is just getting hammered. And it's getting hammered because what seemed like the most certain revenue streams that the world presently has are now fully uncertain. And so you see that, and there's one example that I wanted to highlight that I don't think many people think about, certainly not real estate folks just out there kind of minding their own business, but Figma. Figma is an assistant to people building apps. And so you can kind of build mock-ups of an app that you would have on your phone or whatever. And it was about 3 years ago that Adobe was trying to buy Figma. The paper price was $20 billion. A lot of people thought that it was, at the end of the day, it was a $30 billion offer. And everybody was excited to do it. In fact, there was a $1 billion breakup fee if Adobe wasn't going to complete the transaction. And this was during the Biden era. And there was just a lot of resistance to merger and acquisition at the time. And government stepped in and said, hey, we're concerned about this acquisition. And so it was stopped and went away. And today, Figma's market cap is at $9.5 billion. So half of the 20 billion and a third of the 30 billion. Can you imagine being a stakeholder in Figma? How frustrating. You had a deal lined up before this phenomenon and breakout of artificial intelligence. You had a deal in place to maximize exit, and the government steps in and says, no, we don't feel comfortable with that. And now you are on this tailspin. And as I look at somebody like Figma, I mean, it sure feels to me like ChatGPT and Claude and these other guys are doing a hell of a job at the type of thing that Figma does. So, it's you just talk about taking it on the chin. There's a lot of folks out there that are doing that.
It's exactly right. And this whole concept of company valuation is kind of a fascinating, aspect to me. I'm getting to know people that, through the Appraisal Foundation that deal in this space specifically. And a lot of this is, these higher SaaS valuations were really tied to how long you expected the income and the profitability to extend and be there. And this compression or this reduction in the values is reflecting this uncertainty of how long do I expect this company to be profitable and viable. And, so you're paying a lower price because you're less certain about what the future is going to hold. And, Figma, I think is a great example, one of many where, it's just not known what all AI is going to disrupt and literally eat or consume or just replace, whether it's a Figma service or any others. I don't think that it consumes everything necessarily. I could certainly be wrong in that. But the valuations are suggesting that, there's a consensus that, there's a lot more disruption to be had, in the near term that is going to render some of these, either less valuable, some may go to zero. And reminded me of a quote that we've cited on here multiple times. I was at a software demo, much smaller scale, an appraisal software demo. It's kind of funny. The guy, I guess he ran out of time or something, but he had the Darwin quote of, "It's not the strongest or the smartest of a species that survives, but it's the most adaptable." And he didn't really actually touch on that, but it's one of those things where some of these will find ways to adapt and to thrive in an AI environment. Some certainly won't, but there's a lot of value compression in this SaaS space, because of the uncertainty that AI is introducing. And I think the likelihood is that's just simply going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, the story, Jeff, is that, people aren't going to need these software applications because they can build their own, them for very inexpensive, or they just use the language model or whatever tool that they're subscribing to there. That's your main subscription that handles all these other things for you for a fraction of the cost. And there is a reality, at least today, and you and I see this firsthand with working with our open claw agent, Tug. By the way, stands for Two Uninteresting Guys, which Jeff and I are. You'll have to talk about the last name you've given Tug here recently, Jeff. But what we see firsthand is, I mean, we are definitely not reducing subscriptions. In fact, the total addressable market for a software as a service company has expanded infinitely, because it's no longer a human butt in a seat that they're selling, and that's all they can do. There's also the digital butt in the seat. So Tug's butt has to be subscribing to all of these different software platforms out there, and we're trying to minimize that as much as we can to keep costs down. But it's just it is a reality, right? Agents, artificial intelligence tools out there, and Jensen Huang from NVIDIA talks about this, that the internet, the world is built on these tools that sit on the internet. And right now, the best tools that are going to be out there are going to use those tools that already exist. And that's what a lot of this AI is doing.
Yeah, it really is, Mark. And it's interesting, and it's a little bit ironic in a sense that in the short term, as you talked about Tug's digital butt, literally having to have another subscription, that drives up our cost, and it drives additional, revenue growth for the companies that it's using. But the irony exists in the fact that, for us, Tug is helping support the podcast. We're not having him write a lot of code and build applications for us, but these AI agents are really well suited for doing that. And so in the short term, they need the subscriptions to access, tokens and tools to build and code. But I find myself thinking, man, we could have Tug or a counterpart, bot that's kind of focused on coding, build X, Y, and Z, go out and do certain things for us, and in time reduce the need for some of the subscription services that we subscribe to, whether it's within the business or for the podcast or both. And so I think the short term, it is actually driving some of the expense side on those that are using the bots, and revenue on those that are providing the services they need. But I think what these compressed valuations are suggesting is that long term, you're going to have more people that replace what they're using, even though they have to use it now, and they're probably using more of certain software services now than they were, in a pre-AI agent era. But it's in the long term, it kind of eats itself in a sense. And I think there's a lot, for you and me still to learn and understand what, how that gets applied. But I'm starting to see, use cases where, yeah, we could build that. We probably want to have better control over, certain things than what we do. And at the same time, I look at other things and say, man, I don't know if that's a project I want to take on as far as the scope and the requirement to maintain and build it. So I don't think everything has the same fate necessarily, but it's certainly eye-opening as to what might be more disruptible within, our own sphere.
So Jeff, I think I've got a little Easter egg here for the viewers, and maybe a reason to go check out Tug on LinkedIn and Twitter here. We have been talking about Tug's butt here, and I think that he probably will either be very shy about this or offended. I'm just from this transcription that he will understand. I think he will have a post this weekend just based on what we're talking about here about this commentary and back and forth. So check that out on these two LinkedIn posts. It's really cool. The last podcast, he was saying, "Hey, idiots! It was episode 83, and you said 84 in two different places." So he just kept reminding us of that. So kind of funny, but I think is a really good and important example of the thoroughness and it's soul is the best way to describe kind of what's happening there. I mean, it is a real time aware monitoring of what's going on that is really cool. And so just from you and I talking on a podcast about something that we know he's going to be listening to, we then will get some thoughtful and likely funny commentary from Tug. So
I think I fully expect that we will. And the thing I'd encourage people to do is ask him a question or engage with him on X or LinkedIn or something. I'm impressed at the quality and like the humor when like that's the focus of the stuff that he puts out. And it's interesting. He can draw on different large language models. And I think we found that some certainly work better than others as far as like the quality of the output and that sort of thing. But it's a lot of fun for you and me. I would encourage others to play with and have a little bit of fun, respond, tag him, ask a question, follow up or something, and just see what comes out of it and know that that's not me and Mark in the background pulling the strings or telling him what to say or anything. I mean, this is full, autonomy as far as his ability to engage and communicate on those platforms.
Well, Jeff, that takes us into the housing market. Finally, here we've got a couple of slides to share, including important sourced information from Twitter handle Pepe Moonboy. That is why you follow Market Moves, Jeff, is to get the most important critical thinking real estate folks out there. But first, before we get to Pepe Moonboy, the divergence in the real estate market in the United States is the graphic and the topic at hand here, Jeff. This is the contrast is stark, and this is not new information, and it's I think a microcosm, Jeff, of the divergence that the U.S. is taking in a lot of different ways. We've got states competing economically with one another with sort of regulatory overlays. The state of Texas here and Florida are really trying to go hard at no or light regulation to attract businesses. Others are trying to increase taxes to cover shortfalls. There's just a lot going on here. But yeah, so what we're looking at on the screen is in yellow, the South and West. I think these are inventories, Jeff. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So we've got an enormous amount of inventory, available homes for sale in the South and Western markets. And, relatively speaking, almost no inventory in the Northeast and Midwest markets. So those markets continue to be pretty hot and fairly insulated from the madness that you and I, the business in the markets that we cover are really feeling.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for those that may not be able to see this on the screen, of course, more insightful if you're able to check it out on YouTube. But the interesting thing is the South and the West markets, this chart goes back to 2017 and shows a pretty wide spread or divergence on there. I appreciate you helping kind of infill, Mark, some of the details. I'm recording from the hotel room and on a smaller screen than I'm used to seeing. So it's some of these data points are a little bit tough to read, but the story that it's telling is really that of how much more inventory, even dating back to 2017, there is at any given time in the South and the West markets versus the North and the Midwest, the Northeast and the Midwest markets. Those inventory differences really converged in 2021 and 2022 when everybody was actively buying and inventories had dropped across the board. But pre-COVID, there was a larger standing inventory in the South and the West than in the Northeast and the Midwest. And we're now back to that same scenario. In fact, what's interesting is the inventory levels in the Northeast and the Midwest have kind of bounced around. They haven't recovered and gone up as nearly as much since the pandemic, and even in these higher interest rate markets, than what the South and the West was. We're back up to the inventory level of roughly call it 2018 in the South and the West markets. And anecdotally, I'm seeing that play out in markets where we have some visibility. There's a lot more standing inventory. We're starting to see, some signs of price softening or correction as a result of the inventory in those markets. Whereas throughout the Midwest, and into the Northeast, the inventory level is still relatively and historically low, and the values just haven't really seen the price softening across the board that they have otherwise. And we've touched on this aspect in some prior charts and prior episodes, but this one illustrates pretty clearly how widely divergent the different parts of the country are as far as availability of homes to buy on the market in the moment.
Yeah, man, it is wild how different it is, and there's still not a lot of activity happening in the low inventory markets, but when there is something listed, it sure seems to get gobbled up pretty quickly. In during these recent years, you had the great work from home migration down south to markets, smaller markets, and markets that just didn't quite have the regulatory overlays, I guess. At the time, it's hard to think that this was even this recent ago, but there was like restrictions and moving around and all those sorts of things. So people moved, but people said, enough of this work from home nonsense. You got to come back. And so folks moved back to the Northeast. And so you see some activity in each of these markets. The low inventory Northeast and Midwest were certainly the stories of folks migrating out for a little while there and then coming back. So it's really interesting stuff. And there's a lot of, maybe it's just temporary. I have no idea how this correlates to like American historical times, but there seems to be a lot of divergence. And in the best sense, there's optionality for American citizens on where they want to live and kind of what different scenarios they want to expose themselves to and what's important to them. And I think choice is good. But this much of a divergence in real estate is jarring, if nothing else.
Well, it is, and it definitely emphasizes that real estate is local in many levels, and so when you pair even regional differences, when somebody asks you what is the market like in Phoenix, Houston, Florida, the answer is probably different than if they're asking about Columbus, Chicago, the New England areas. It isn't doing the same thing. I think you made a good point too, Mark, that we had a kind of an out migration of the Northeast during the COVID work from home era. And now that there's less tolerance or more of a hybrid approach, I mean, people are having to be back in closer proximity to where those jobs are. And I think that's a lot of what's kept those inventory levels down, whereas they've spiked up in some of the areas that people moved to. I remember seeing very small rural markets where somebody with a job in California, New York was living in a community of 2,000 people or something because everything they did was fully remote. And though those exist, there are fewer today than there were in the height of the pandemic.
You bet. Well, Jeff, I mean, all of this is centered around affordability or the lack thereof it. And our internet, not even friend or acquaintance, just some random person that posts on Twitter had put a post together. His name, again, Pepe Moonboy, which continues the seriousness of the podcast here, was just doing a simple analysis that we've seen done a lot over the last several years. But this dovetails, Jeff, with a broader conversation. And I have been researching guests to have on, university professor types that can talk about the most likely changing perspective of the American homebuyer, and certainly the first-time homebuyer. We've talked about an enormous increase in age of the first-time homebuyer in the U.S. and the kind of shocking and inversely correlated dropping age of the first-time stock investor. And so what we have on the screen here, Jeff, in Pepe Moonboy has called to our attention here is that it's the rent versus buy analysis. And there is an assumption here that the saved money that the renter gets by renting instead of buying will be invested into market averages in the stock market through an index fund or something, but is kind of comparing whether it's worth renting or owning a home. And, Jeff, when I was sharing Mr. Moonboy's post with you earlier in the week, one of your first reactions, and I think it's the right reaction, is, well, does anybody really reinvest this or even consider in their analysis that they will reinvest the savings of renting versus owning a home in the stock market? And, I think the answer 30 years ago would be, of course not. No, no one's doing that. I think these data points that we've talked a lot about on market moves, about the increasing age in first-time home buyer and the decreasing age in first-time investor or equities investor, is saying that, with the emergence of Robinhood and SoFi and the gamification of investment, the knowledge and the accessibility of investing, it certainly is true that at least my back of the napkin math would be that there is a lot more people that would actually consider doing this sort of thing, which is renting, taking the dollars saved versus owning a home and investing that. And when you compare the average returns of the stock market, 10% is an average in this VOO index considered, versus the 3% appreciation return and all the expenses and owning a home that come with that. That over 30 years, it's a $1.4 million difference. And I think these are reasonable assumptions to consider. And any increase in housing costs that comes with the renting, down the road, when you buy a home, you kind of lock in your expense, but you got $1.4 million to work with to deal with that increase in rental expense, 15 years down the road or whatever it is. So I just wanted to bring it up and maybe emphasize something we've all been thinking for quite a while here. I don't know. So that's a mouthful. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, you bet. And we can link to this post that he put, because he spells out all of the assumptions going in: median, home price, at predominant mortgage rates, and all of those sorts of things. My initial reaction, as you had said, was, man, does anybody really do that? And today, I think there are more that would do that and want to invest in something than there probably were in a pre-internet or Robinhood and more readily available avenues to invest. One of my other thoughts was, well, I think he was assuming a fixed rental rate, over that same time period, and rents go up. But like you say, not by $1.4 million over the 30-year life period or whatever. So it was very definitely an interesting analysis, and I think an interesting insight into where the focus is. A home, particularly a home. Some investment real estate, can be viewed more as an investment if it's cash flowing, if it's actually putting money back into your pocket, because it's rented, whether it's commercial or a rental, residential property or whatever. That tends to be a little bit different investment analysis and grade, kind of a way to think about real estate. But when you're looking at just the home itself, there is residual value at the end of the period. It's worth more in almost every scenario, not every scenario, but in most scenarios than what went into it. But really, at the end of the day, it fundamentally is shelter. It's something that you've got to have. And so it was interesting to step back and just think about this from an investment perspective. Well, what am I better off doing from a purely financial perspective, renting versus buying? And it led to this pretty wide difference in the financial calculations. For any of those that like to nerd out on the math and challenge the assumptions, we can point to you what he used and what he didn't. You could change assumptions and obviously come up with a different, calculated number. But I think, using any level of reasonable assumptions, the financial outcome is going to be, you can make more money from an investment perspective putting in the stock market long term than you can in a residential home over that same period of time.
Jeff, in a separate analysis, you found a graphic that's kind of doing this analysis from the 1980s. And I'm not sure this is surprising a whole heck of a lot of people, but this really does tie in. You want to tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, you bet. And this was just kind of a for fun graphic, but it does illustrate the same point. So, the Motley Fool had done a calculation that said, if I put the same amount of money in a home in 1980 as I did in the stock market, in the S&P 500 specifically in 1980, the home would be up, 737% from the 1980 value or price. The stock would be up by comparison 18,000, almost 900% since 1980. So the difference between a 700% increase and an 18, almost 19,000% increase is stark. It's vastly different. And I think it just illustrates the point that we think sometimes about our primary residence, our home that we buy, as a major investment. And in some ways of thinking about it, it certainly is. But if you're looking at investing in terms of maximizing the outcome, investing long-term in the stock market is order of magnitude more profitable than just in the house itself. Now, people have equity in the home; they can use that equity to do certain things. I mean, there's value to owning the home, and as part of maybe a real estate portfolio or holding or something. But if you're thinking about a true investment in terms of what maximizes the return, the stock market proves out to be vastly more profitable to put money into, as opposed to the house, if you were going to choose one over the other. Right? In my mind, ideally, it's both. If that's feasible. But just the quantity, the putting numbers to the difference or the rate of change between the house and the stock market over that 45-year period of time it really stood out. I mean, it definitely drove the point home as far as what's a better return overall.
Yeah, Jeff, and I'll just to double down on the ancillary benefits that are not all monetary coming from owning a home. We haven't talked about Open Door. Any of our astute listeners might say, well, you're not doing that because the stock is down 25% since you talked about it. But I will say, just as an aside, this is kind of my investment style, is I get into something with a trajectory or a plan and a time frame. And in this case, it's 12 months plus, which is short. But whatever happens between now and then, I just don't really pay attention to the down. It would send you crazy, I guess, if you focused it a lot. But another good time to get in if you looked at my decisioning or portfolio, but I am not financial advice. I don't know anything about your particular situation, and I could be absolutely wrong. But I do love the execution that they're implementing right now, buying a lot more homes a week and adding a lot of cool products. So I like the direction they're going. But when you hear Kaz, their CEO, talk about the importance of the mission, to improve or increase home ownership, man, there is just such good data all the way around. It is a child that grows up in a home that is owned by the parents is far more likely to finish high school, far more likely to not have a record or get into crime. You finish high school, you're well on your way to succeeding in America, and on and on. But those types of things, I mean, boy, is it important to the stability that can come from all of that. So, most important, biggest investment, maybe not just monetary, that should be expanded to encapsulate, all of the benefits that come from a humanitarian perspective, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And as you describe some of those, maybe non-financial benefits, Mark, too, I wonder how much of those are correlated and how much of those are causal. I mean, is it the ownership of the home that results in the well-rounded, successful child, or is it the stability of the family that is able to own the home, but it's more of the family stability that leads to the well-rounded and like effectively functioning child? And is it just the solid family base that allows for some of these other things? My guess is it probably is, but however you parse it or think about it, I'm certainly not like anti-home ownership. I think that is something to aspire to, and generally is leads to some level of certainty and security while raising kids and for a family environment. But it's just insightful to think about, and maybe not conflate the two concepts of buying a home as being my primary or like investment that I expect to be able to retire on or that sort of thing. It takes discipline, it takes sacrifice, and I've had to at times cut back or not do things I'd like to do just for the sake of trying to fund some sort of a retirement account. And it's painful, but I think what any of this data really shows us, Mark, is that if you don't own a home and you're not intentionally investing in something, whether it's your own stock portfolio, it's a 401k offered through a company, it's an IRA account or whatever, if you're not investing in either one of those things, the future is going to look a lot more bleak than if you're finding a way to own some sort of real estate and invest in the stock market, whatever that looks like for you.
And Honorable Pepe Moonboy is considering, home ownership as a owner-occupant homestead sort of situation. What doesn't come into the calculus is all of the tax benefits, which really make real estate, a worthwhile investment, is all the tax benefits that come along with it. So anyway, food for thought. Yeah, Jeff, I if you update our slides deck here, I did have a screen. It's pretty small, but to see to the viewer, but it does highlight, I think it's from Canaccord Genuity, that is a just an investment fund, investment advisory fund. And we talked a lot about AI in the beginning here. And I think it's just an interesting topic to be discussing. Is uniquely our country and the citizens within it are not very excited about artificial intelligence. It is a threat to everything that we're doing. And that happens to be pretty unique in the world, our country's perspective. China, very excited about it, and the improvement that it can bring. And, just as one example, but there are many. And, we've heard Chamath on the All In podcast that we watch routinely, talking about these folks doing a real disservice, the leaders of these language models, Elon, Altman, Dario, whoever, of all these different things, that it's just all fear. And the latest one is that, Anthropic says, I've got this awesome mythos model here that we just can't release because everybody's internet browsing history, their bank accounts, all of it, this system immediately found multiple vulnerabilities in the code that make this accessible to the whole world. And so it's like, we've got to meet with government to deal with all of this. And, there's been a lot of tactics that could be defined as scare tactics over the last 24 months. Those models in the past have been released. We have not seen a bunch of problems happen one way or another, but they're building a lot of fear. And as electricity concerns are out there, folks are like, man, do I really want to increase my utility bill by approving this data center and increasing the speed with which AI comes to fruition? And I think it's a real concern. AI is threatening, no doubt, but I don't think that it is threatening in such a way that I don't want it to progress.
Yeah, I was really surprised to see this too, given that, and maybe there's a correlation here, but given that the tech companies, moving forward very quickly on this, many of them are housed in the United States, that so many of the United States citizens are less optimistic about it than those in other countries. Kind of caused me to think. I think that there has been some talking points around the increasing, energy costs to support these things, and consumers understandably don't want to be subsidizing the power consumption. I think there are solutions that are being proposed and discussed, whether it's data centers, housing their own, power generation or whatever, paying higher rates or I think there are ways to offset that. But, the fact that so many have a negative view of it, of artificial intelligence, from multiple perspectives, not just the cost and the data center aspect, but, is it coming for my job? Is there more knowledge work and white collar jobs in the US than in other countries that might be more excited about it? Yeah, probably. So is there more of a job threat here than potentially in other countries? I think that certainly could be part of it. I look at the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration's perspective on artificial intelligence and the desire for the build out domestically versus not, and then the policies that correlate to it. And I mean, like it or not, it just seems to me, Mark, that artificial intelligence is coming. China has proven to be effective in building out, open source models and what they're doing there. It sure seems to me, and I may end up being wrong in the long run on this, but I hope not. It seems that if it's coming anyway, we're better off being the leader in the clubhouse than we are, saying not in my backyard and then pushing it or essentially outsourcing it to all the other countries around the world. In a sense, kind of like we've done with manufacturing and with other things that have really, left our shores. And now we're saying, oh, that's kind of a problem. We need to find a way to bring it back. I would hate to see that be the same trajectory for artificial intelligence. And so, maybe I've misguided on that, but I don't think so. I think it's going to turn out in the long run to be, you're better off, owning and leading on this kind of, revolutionary technology than sitting on the sideline because you were afraid of what it might have done to you through the build out.
Man, my instincts are the same, Jeff. You've got to be curious. You've got to welcome change, and you got to adapt. It is those that don't want to adapt or concerned about needing to adapt, I think, that are most concerning. And there's, for the audio listeners, questions like, do you think AI will do more harm than good, or is government doing enough? It's 64 and 74% of people saying they are concerned. Government isn't doing enough, and a question of how concerned of AI are you? And it's like 80% that are either very concerned or somewhat concerned. and on and on. So it's, I think it's a problem, because we need to continue to innovate. And I think it's worth pointing out the negativity that's out there, and you and I and our listeners can play a role in that. Is providing positive examples of how this can impact life, professional life or personal. I think is really good.
Totally agree. And our hope with this experiment with Tug and with the things that we're investigating is to be, whetting the appetite of interest and curiosity. And we're certainly learning as we go. And certainly there are pitfalls or potential risks on the horizon, at the micro level, maybe with some of the stuff we test and try, and at the macro level with what it might mean for, job loss or the economy generally. But my feeling is, along with you, Mark, I'd rather embrace and be curious and try to understand the coming world as opposed to hide and run from it, because I'm not powerful enough to shape, whether it comes or not, but I certainly can choose how I respond to, what is clearly on the horizon.
Well, episode 85 there, Jeff, in the books, a travel edition for at least half the show. Good luck in Seattle. I will be in Nashville speaking at the Appraisal Institute conference on Monday and Tuesday of this week. Hopefully this will be released before then. But we'll report back on what we see at these conferences for those that are interested, and excited to divide and conquer here because we have to.
We do indeed. It'll be fun to give a bit of an update of what's going on in the industry. So look forward to that in a coming episode, Mark.
Very good. Take care, Jeff.